Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Engage with Catholic Faith with Father Jay. Today, our topic is going to continue on some of our sacraments. This week, we are going to be looking at holy orders. So, the idea is we have a lot of different religious people.
Right.
We have sisters, we have fathers, we have deacons, priests, deacons, bishops, cardinals, any number of them. And
Right.
today we're kind of going to go into what is the difference? What can some of them do versus what they are not allowed to do? And what the extra titles mean. Is there actually a difference between a Monsignor and a priest? So, or father or Monsignor. So let's start kind of with the first step in holy orders, which would be
The first step in holy orders is being ordained a deacon. And for that, you go through your seminary training and you are recommended to be a deacon by the trainers, those in charge of your training. And there are two types of deacons. And the first type, which was a predominant type in the past, was a transitional deacon. The other is a permanent deacon, and that was only restored in the 1970s. Before that, that had not been used for centuries upon centuries.
it's that recent.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes. And the reason behind its restoration was basically for missionary lands where there was a lack of priests. And so they put in replacing, in a certain sense, with permanent deacons. Those who were ordained into what you would call the first level of priesthood, which is deacon. And so it developed. Amazingly enough, it has been put to use more in the non-missionary countries than the missionary countries. The missionary countries weren't as willing to accept it.
Well, which is interesting because for me, that would be my entire lifetime of having deacons.
Right.
And it just, in my mind, it's a permanent fixture. And really, up until more recent years, I grew up with a deacon at every Mass. When I first started working at a different church than was my home church, there was always a deacon there. So I thought of it as a permanent fixture, and it was rare when the deacon wasn't there.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, it's a development within the church, and it certainly is helpful in the church where there are less priests, and we're getting less and less priests in our time span. And so we're going to have to make adjustments, and we're going to have to deal with things. Now, with deacons as a whole, permanent or transitional, what they do is they do work in a parish, they help out in a parish, and with the permanent deacons, of course, they can be married.
Mm-hmm.
But they have to be married before they are ordained.
I didn't know that requirement was there. I had thought they could get married at any point, so they must be married before
they're ordained. The second one, and that's a whole other story. And then basically what they do, or what they're able to, is obvious things that have always been done. They visit the sick, they take communion to the sick, which, as we know in our own days, Eucharistic ministers can do.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of less. Deacons can baptize. They can administer the sacrament of baptism. And they can also preach. to proclaim the Word of God. They read the Gospel at Mass. And basically, that is their liturgical sacramental function. They can assist at the Eucharist, but they cannot confect the Eucharist, which the priest does. They can also perform or witness marriages. I forgot about that. They can witness marriages where the marriage will take place outside of Mass. And they can't hear confessions. They can't anoint the sick. And of course, they can't ordain people because, well, that's restricted to bishops anyways.
So, moving on to the next level, because the transitional one, as said by its name, transitions into a priest, which I would argue is the one we're most familiar with, even above deacons.
Right. Well, like I said, there are 3 levels of the priesthood in the church: deacon, diaconal, presbyteral, and episcopal. Presbyterial is what we call priests. Episcopal is what we call bishops.
Which is kind of interesting because the other denominations, just as a sidebar, because I didn't know those terms, you have Presbyterian and you have Episcopal, Episcopalian. So it's interesting that those words were used for the other denominations.
Well, they can go back to the original Greek, with presbyteral being an elder.
Okay.
An elder in the church, as sometimes the early priesthood was called, the elders, but they were the ones who celebrated the Eucharist. Episcopal, well, that name was used when the American Anglican, after the American Revolution, when, well, what are we? We belong to the Church of England. Well, that doesn't sound too good. So they became Episcopal, which meant that they had a hierarchy of bishops.
Okay.
So at any rate, hopefully that clears that little bit up. But at any rate, you go on to the presbyteral or priesthood, where you can celebrate the Eucharist, you can anoint the sick, you can perform all of the sacraments except holy orders.
And priests can actually perform confirmation, even though
they can under certain circumstances. Again, to be quite honest, I have performed confirmations. Partially, especially in the beginning of my priesthood, it's when you bring somebody into the church, when you bring an adult into the church, and you perform baptism, Eucharist, and confirmation. Or if they've already been baptized, say in a Protestant church, then you have a profession of faith, Eucharist, and confirmation. The priest who is bringing the person into the faith has the ability to confirm in those circumstances, always. Aside from that, I've also performed group confirmations where I was delegated to by the bishop at a point where there were hardly any bishops, where there was a whole transition before Bishop Fisher came and after
Malone.
Thank you, Bishop Malone, the in-between period. And so it seemed to be just too much for the Bishop of Albany, who was the administrator of the diocese, and the Vicar General to perform all the confirmations in the certain parishes. So they delegated the pastors of those parishes to be able to confirm their confirmation classes.
So, just to make sure we're hitting all of it. So the bishop, the added part of the bishop, aside from overseeing a diocese,
right,
is that they have the ability to perform holy orders,
right,
for incoming
Priesthood.
deacons, priests.
Right.
How, and there's sometimes more than one in a diocese. How does that work with the difference between, because I know at one point we had auxiliary bishops. That was
Right.
the term.
Right. Well, again, we're jumping
Oh,
a
yeah.
notch.
Yes, because I skipped but I want to go back to that one since we
Anyway,
mentioned bishops.
Yes. All right. Bishops are basically the chief shepherd of a church. We've had bishops from the beginning as they were the successors of the apostles. And they were appointed by the apostles to begin with as the church spread and spread and spread. And you have examples of two early bishops in Timothy and Titus, who were bishops, and they were disciples of St. Paul's. And he wrote letters to them, or someone did in his name anyways, and it's in the New Testament. And one was bishop in Antioch, the other was a bishop of Cyprus. So they were basically right from the beginning. Just as we find deacons in the New Testament too, in the Acts of the Apostles, where the apostles, basically said, well, we're busy preaching the word. We don't have time to feed the people, to wait on tables is the exact phrase. And that's what deacons were originally called to do, to wait on the faithful, because they gathered in community, fed the widows, the orphans, etc. And that was the original job of the deacons. Of course, it didn't hold very long because we have the first martyr, St. Stephen, a deacon, who was preaching the word and was martyred for preaching the word. So that was how things developed. In the beginning, it wasn't as, structured, you might say, as it became over time, with distinctions, real heavy distinctions. The deacons would not even back then celebrate the Eucharist, which the apostles would. And, it was very clear that even in some of St. Paul's letters, we find that the establishment of a priesthood there.
So the bishop ends up being the high one, and then the auxiliary, I guess, would just be assistant then.
Basically, in the structure, yes, but a bishop, to be a bishop, you have to have some place to be a shepherd of. And auxiliary bishops are what they call titular bishops. They have a title to a diocese, and they're bishop of a diocese that actually no longer exists.
Oh.
And then they are appointed as an assistant to a bishop, say of Buffalo, Detroit, New York, whatever. And so, and sometimes people think of it as a bishop with training wheels to become a bishop of another diocese at some time, or perhaps even the diocese that they're auxiliary of. You also have what is called a coadjutor bishop, which is a bishop who is appointed with more powers and shares them with the diocesan bishop, and is, upon that bishop's retirement, his successor.
Okay, so there's sometimes where they plan for...
Right.
They actually have a plan in place, which I actually kind of think is almost a better idea than kind of going and scrambling.
But the coadjutor usually is appointed in a place where Rome feels that the bishop of that diocese isn't up to snuff. And they take some of the powers of that bishop and give them to the coadjutor. And so it's kind of a slap in the face for a coadjutor to be appointed.
Okay, and that does make sense. I do want to bounce back with the priesthood because this was something that I had said before we started filming. What is the difference between a priest that we call father or a Monsignor? Now, I want to bring up why I wanted to touch on this is because when I first started, so I grew up at Timothy's where we had Monsignor Doucette. I always called him Monsignor Doucette to what I had understood in my childlike mind was a Monsignor is the actual pastor of a parish. And then when I got to St. Paul's with you, and the reason I brought it up is it was Father J, Father J, Father J. I was like, oh, he can't be the pastor because it's not Monsignor McGinnis, which you were the pastor, and that created a great deal of confusion in my 21-year-old mind because I grew up with a pastor that was a Monsignor. So can you help clarify the difference between Monsignor versus Father?
Well, ecclesially, there's absolutely no difference. A Monsignor is basically an honorary title, kind of like a reward, a gold star for a student, or whatever you want to call it. And there are different types of Monsignors. There are 3 levels of Monsignors. There's God. We don't have them much anymore, and my brain is having a senior moment in trying to do the difference. They were very, in my younger days, there was a very Reverend Monsignor, a Right Reverend Monsignor, and the difference was that one was a lower rank of honorary title than the other one. They're both papal chamberlains, etc. is what they are. There is a higher one that is kind of in between priest and bishop.
Okay.
And I cannot even pronounce the name.
Because it seems like it's a much rarer, even Monsignor, I would argue, is a much rarer title than
it is today than it once was.
So, really, at the end of the day, it's honorary.
It basically distinguishes a priest who, in the feeling of basically the bishop, has done a good job, has spent many years in the job, and has performed well and deserves to be rewarded, honored. And so he submits the name to Rome, and Rome names them. Mm-hmm. The Vatican names them.
So, and again, that's not something that we hear quite often anymore, because I can't think of anybody who is really of the younger priesthood. I mean, in my mind, the only 3 I can name off the top of it, 4, Monsignor Wetter, Monsignor Welgen, Monsignor Doucette, since I grew up with him, Monsignor Zapfel, off the top of my head. And really anybody who's younger.
And the first 3 that you mentioned are not younger.
Yes, and that's, I can't think of any priest below the age of 50.
And Monsignor Zapfel went to Rome, was an assistant in the Vatican Secretariat of Education, and the bishop, who was the head of that, recommended that he be named a Monsignor. Mm-hmm. There really haven't been many Monsignors named recently. It's kind of a thing that's more selective today, I guess you might say, than in the past.
So then moving up, just because the next thing that we hear, obviously there's a difference between an archbishop versus a bishop, but I think it's just size of their diocese.
No, basically, what an archbishop is that the the church in its ecclesial structure is based on the old Roman Empire. Dioceses came into existence in the Roman Empire during the reign of Diocletian.
Oh, well.
And he created these, if you want to call them states or whatever. But there were also provinces that there were more dioceses in.
Okay.
So there was, varying levels of authority in the Roman Empire.
Like a city versus a state.
Kind of like that, yeah. So at any rate, over time, there became a province. And an archbishop is the, I guess you want to call it, titular head of the province. We, in the Diocese of Buffalo, are under the province of New York. But the Archbishop of New York does not exercise bishops. He doesn't kind of run the Diocese of Buffalo.
Mm-hmm.
The bishops get together in conference and they do things, but he's like the chairman or the leading figure in it. You find another, the Archbishop of Boston, the Archbishop of Hartford. They all have their own provinces.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have the Archbishop of Philadelphia. And, there's all these differing archbishops, but they're head of each of the provinces. And I'm not sure of all of the divisions in all of them, because I know that New York is just New York State, period.
Mm-hmm.
But there are numerous dioceses in New York State. And so we've got the Diocese of
Rochester.
Well, Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Ogdensburg, Albany, Brooklyn, Rockville Center, and the Archdiocese of New York.
Mm-hmm.
So we have like 8 dioceses in the province of New York.
So then we move up to cardinal. And where does cardinal fit in?
Well, cardinal is, amazingly enough, a title which is reserved as, in this day and age, a papal elector.
Mm-hmm.
Someone who is able to be a part of the conclave that elects the Pope. That's been reserved to cardinals under 80 now, or 80 and under. And so you have this group. First of all, they do not have to be bishops. They do not have to be priests.
Really?
There have been laymen who were cardinals. And so, it kind of isn't in that priesthood, but most of the cardinals are. And, they're distinguished in rank, if you want to say. There are cardinal bishops, there are cardinal priests, there are cardinal deacons. They aren't those things, but, they boom, boom, boom. More important, less important. I don't know why they do that. Well, it's just a hang-on, I guess, from times when people exercised more power than they actually do today.
And so they're part of it, and to my understanding, it's a 2/3 majority elects the Pope or something like that.
Basically, yes.
Of the ones under 80.
Well, the ones who are in the conclave.
Mm-hmm.
Ones who, vote in the conclave. So, yes, it is basically a 2/3 vote to elect the Pope.
And then finally, at least on this episode, because we'll wrap it up, we'll probably talk about the difference between orders and stuff like that at a different date. But the head of the church, the Bishop of Rome,
correct,
would be the The Pope, as we all know, who has
universal jurisdiction over the entire church. The successor of St. Peter, upon whom the church was founded by Christ, the rock that Christ put as the head of the church.
And all powers are in him, as well as there was something about Pope infallibility, but I think that's specific to...
Well, that's specific to...
My youth remembers the term ex cathedra or something like that.
It's basically, when the Pope speaks on a matter of faith or morals, ex cathedra. And that means from the chair, from the throne of Peter.
Mm-hmm.
It's been used twice.
Oh, considering the fact that it was brought up at some different points, I had no idea that it's been that rare.
Well, that's the whole point, and I think it's been a confusing point for the people of the church, because a lot of them think that everything the Pope says is infallible, which is not true. It is necessarily, obviously, a teaching of the church, and an important teaching of the church, what the Pope says. That does not make it infallible, as we come across things that have changed over time. And we have had popes change things that previous popes have done.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because they need to change, because the situation is totally different.
Well, we don't live in 25, or 100 AD. We don't live in 200 AD. They couldn't even imagine the communication levels, the travel levels, the different needs of people, humans.
We don't even live in 1500s AD, during the Protestant Reformation. The things that the church did and said, the Pope said, and the council said at that time in reaction to the Protestant Reformation, some of which have become outdated in certain ways, others that are perfectly the same. So again, you have popes having to change things and not make them ex cathedra, or else we end up with a very brittle structure.
And I think brittle is really a great term for it. And I think the other thing is, because people have always talked, there's always that line, and we'll kind of leave with this because it opens up for a topic in the future of, well, the church never changes, the church is the same. And I would argue yes and no. The foundation of the church is the same. Christ is the same. Eucharist is the same. But there are other aspects that have needed to, or have had to address the times.
There's always growth in the human existence. The church is divine, and the church is human. It's one of the things I remember very well being taught when I was a kid in school, back when the Mass was in Latin, everything else, and the nuns were drilling everything into our heads. The church is divine and human. It is totally infallible and totally the same in its divinity. The human side is a little bit different.
And I think there's a lot of truth in that, because otherwise, if you don't accept that reality, every time a pope changes something.
Well, every time a pope does anything, it's just like, again, if everything stays exactly the same, you have a very brittle church that cannot respond to the needs of the time. Christ responded to the needs of his time. Christ gave a church to respond to the needs of the times in which it exists. And that is love. Love, love. Always trumps everything else.
And I think there's no better way to end this week's episode than that message. So we want to thank you for joining us. We hope that the end of summer for you is wonderful, and you have at least another blessed week. I hope on Monday you enjoy your Labor Days together with your families. And we will see you next Friday. Keep sending us any of those topics you want discussed. And thank you for all that you do.
Goodbye and have a great holiday.